Hello and welcome back to my 1v1 Arena tier list video series. We've come to the final video in the series. Last video I talked about the C tier civs, and now I'm going to finally talk about the D tier civs. So let's get into it. So as you can probably guess from the naming of the tier itself, D tier civs are civs that I consider to be not particularly good for this map. These civs can have issues with their economy, are extremely predictable, have glaring holes in their tech tree, or a combination of all three of these factors. And some may have powerful late games, but oftentimes they take a ton of time and resources to get to, and with so many flaws, they're unlikely to reach that part of the game at all. And above all, these are just civs that I don't work with very well, and I'll be elaborating on that as I talk about the civs individually. So I'm going to structure the commentary a little bit differently for this tier. Whereas with the previous tiers S, A, B, and C, I talked about the civs' high points before I talked about their low points. I'm going to elaborate on the low points for the D tier civs before I talk about their high points. So to start off my D tier, we have the Persians. Back when I talked about the Franks in A tier, I mentioned how they alongside Persians were considered bottom tier arena civilizations back in the AOC days. But whereas Franks got a lot of buffs with the Warlord Kingdom's expansion really helping out their standing on this map, the Persians have stayed pretty stagnant for the most part. They've only received a pretty meme-worthy technology, unique technology with the boiling oil tech, which is one of the most useless unique technologies in the game. I digress. Getting back into the big picture of the Persians and their standing on this map. So the first big drawback for this civ is the fact that they have absolutely abysmal monks. They are some of the worst monks in the game. It's really a toss-up between this civ and maybe Vikings for who has worse monks. And whoever comes out on top for that one, I mean, the monks are still terrible, needless to say. The second big problem with the civ is the fact that they are quite reliant on cavalry for a good late-game deathball. And so, for example, camel-heavy civs like Indians and Berbers, the civs that can do what the Persians can, but better in a lot of situations, can have a leg up on the Persians as a result. And without their cavalry, the Persians really need to rely on their halbs as well as gunpowder, both of which are pretty generic. Their halbs are fully upgraded, but they don't really have anything special going for them. Their hand cannoneers are pretty generic. And their bomber cannons are pretty generic as well, and plus they miss siege engineers, so you can even argue they're a bit subpar. Their swordsman line is also pretty bottom tier without even access to two-handed swordsmen. So if you're in a situation where you want to be using swordsmen, like for example if your opponent is maybe spamming a lot of trash units, one of the better ways to deal with that kind of strategy from your opponent is to make champions, because they're considered trash busters. But you're going to be pretty reluctant to do something like that with Persians because they don't even have two-handed swordsmen. It's one thing for a civ to miss champion, but missing two-handed swordsmen as well is a pretty big loss in my opinion. Their archers, the other major unit line aside from infantry, is also pretty mediocre without arbs and bracer. And the lack of bracer especially also ends up hurting their skirmishers and especially their cav archers, which are otherwise fully upgraded, but missing that tech means they're held back quite a bit compared to your typical cavalry archer. On top of that, the fact that they miss heresy at the monastery means that their best units are vulnerable to conversions and can be pressured out potentially by heavy monk aggression by top tier monk civs. And so some of their best units include, bombard cannons from their siege workshop, their paladins and war elephants and things like that. And without heresy, they're all vulnerable to conversion. So if you're getting them converted, it can be a big loss for the Persians there. So, but with all that being said, they do have some upsides, which is why I have them high on this tier. The first is the fact that their mid-game boom is pretty solid with the faster working TCs, and the way the Persian uptimes are structured, with the number of villagers you produce, if you can go up with one extra villager for a typical build and still reach the castle age around 25-30 seconds faster than you normally would. So you can go up as late as, for example, 29 plus 2, and you'll still reach Castle Age at like a 28 plus 2 uptime if you're doing a particular strategy like trying to take map control with Scouts and Knights. Because those kinds of builds often involve higher population uptimes. And speaking of which, that makes them a decent candidate for going aggressive with cavalry and siege in the mid-game, and also all the while booming behind it. But like I mentioned, because your swordsman line is pretty subpar, you're going to be a bit hard-pressed to try and make swordsmen to protect your cavalry, because they don't really have a whole lot to go later on in the game in the Imperial Age. They can't be improved upon further. So you might end up using something else like scorpions to back up your knights instead, which they do miss siege engineers, but at least Persians do get access to heavy scorpions, so it can be another avenue you can take. Their late game is all things considered, it's pretty solid. They have full cavalry access. They have their War Elephant unique unit, though considering its pretty staggering cost on an individual level, as well as the upgrades themselves being so expensive, the least of which is the elite upgrade, which costs 1,600 food and 1,200 gold. Yeah, you're not likely to get to that unit in most games, if at all. They also have gunpowder access. Almost fully upgraded trash, just missing bracer for their skirms, as I mentioned earlier, as well as access to siege ram. So if you can get to the late game with Persians, you can feel pretty good against a variety of civs, but overall it's not necessarily the most likely to happen against a good variety of civs out there. So again, civs with good monks can give Persians a hard time, as well as civs that, Persians being such a cavalry-oriented civ can also struggle, like I've mentioned with other civs in previous tiers, against halberdier and heavy siege civs. And so, but at least, Persians have gunpowder access as well, including bombard cannons, so they're not completely out of it, but it's fair to say that those kinds of civs that specialize in halberdier and heavy siege can still end up giving the Persians quite a hard time. Number 2 on my D tier is the classic pro player favorite civ, the Mayans. So this is probably the biggest surprise on this list. Again, pros love them, but I personally cannot stand the civ arena, and I think they're very overrated. And the thing about Mayans, I'll just preface by saying that from what I can tell, speaking with various arena players around my skill level, or even higher than that, maybe like 2K, 2K1 plus, maybe even above that. Mayans is a very polarizing civ on arena. You really either love it or hate it. Like, there is no in between with this civ, and unfortunately for me, I fall into the latter camp where I hate this civ, and so I'll be delving a bit deeper into that. The first is the fact that their monks are pretty mediocre without redemption or illumination, and this can be a big blow because for some reasons that I'll talk about later. Their mid-game boom, so I'm not talking about their Dark Age where it's actually pretty good, but I'm talking about their mid-game boom when you're putting down town centers and you're trying to boom up. The boom itself is kind of anemic because of the fact that their farmers are the worst in the game. The tech tree description on Voobly says it's around 3% slower, but based on some tests that I've run into the scenario editor a few times, the percentage seems to be closer to 5% in the Dark Age. That percentage probably goes down a little bit as when you grab the Ecotex wheelbarrow and handcart, but it's still safe to assume that Mayans are have the slowest farmers in the game overall. And this is because of their longer lasting resource bonus. If they had a regular farming rate on top of the fact that their farms last 15% longer, so the idea is every time the farm goes down 1 food, the Mayans collect 1.15 units of food. That means with a regular farming rate, the Mayans would farm extremely quickly, and so their gather rates had to be brought down in order to balance their longer lasting resource bonus out. They are, of course, also extremely predictable in the late game. They basically have 3 good units, and that's it: plumes, eagles, and siege rams. And essentially, and maybe some variety of trash units. So overall, their late game unit roster is just not very impressive, in my opinion. Um, the thing about their limited tech tree is the fact that it's less of a concern on open maps like Arabia, because one of the things that the Mayans' main units like Eagles and Plumes have going for them is the fact that they're very mobile units. So if you can take advantage of their mobility on maps where there's a lot of space to run around, then usually the fact that they don't have a large unit selection doesn't matter all that much. But as I've mentioned with some other civs in my previous tiers, I'm a firm believer that mobility is just not that big of a concern on Arena, on a closed map like Arena, and therefore, without that asset, without the Mayans without that asset of mobility, just means they fall short in a lot of ways on this particular map type, in my personal opinion. And because of their very limited tech tree on a closed map like this, it means that they're unable to handle pitched fights against many more powerful and pop-efficient late-game civs. So if you look at some civs in my S tier and maybe even my A tier that have access to things like gunpowder, siege onagers, good champions, and things like that, things that can, a combination of units, basically a combo of units that can deal well with eagles and plumes, that means the Mayans are really going to struggle, because outside of those two units, they don't do a whole lot else very well. So if you have a civ that basically clamps down on those two unit types for the Mayans, you're going to have a pretty good shot against them. And going back to that weakness to things like champions and onagers or siege onagers or hand cannoneers and onagers, those kinds of combos, gives Mayans a real headache on open maps for a number of reasons. One is because they have no gunpowder access, so they don't have bombard cannons specifically, so they're not going to be able to snipe onagers that way. They don't, and they also, going back to their issue of mediocre monks, without redemption, they can't convert enemy siege either, unlike their Native American counterparts, Incas and Aztecs, who can. So without those two options available to them, the Mayans, all they can do is suicide a bunch of eagles to try and snipe the onagers. And depending on how many hand cannoneers or champions your opponent can muster and how good his defensive micro with them is to protect his onagers, that's just going to end up being a massive resource strain for you. And if you're Mayans, essentially, if you're Mayans and you're up against these civs like this with these kinds of combos, you basically have to kill them early. That's their MO. If you don't, you're gonna die in the late game. Like there's no two ways about it. So they have no cavalry access, being a Native American civ, so gold has to be spent for late game raiding, just like Mayans, just like Incas and Aztecs as well. They have halbs to throw, and they'll probably have to combine them with siege rams to push into your opponent's base, or spend gold on eagle warriors. Maybe hope that they have some relics so they can get some passive gold income. That said, the Mayans do have some upsides. So the first is the fact that their early game, specifically their Dark Age, is quite strong with the longer lasting sheep, boar, and deer. And this can make for a nice early boost. You can delay your farming eco, and the longer lasting food resources especially can help you with tighter builds, like, for example, again, 25 plus 2 castle drop with a mill start. That can lead straight into plumed archers, which can be nice for taking map control, as well as their eagles. But the problem with the Mayans going map control is, in my opinion, it's a lot flimsier compared to a civ like the Aztecs, for example, because Mayan monks aren't nearly as good as the Aztecs, and plumes being still archers, they're still vulnerable to many of the same counters to regular archers. So knights, and I've seen Mayans losing map control to players contesting map control with knights and a bit of siege as well, a couple scorpions or a mangonel. And if you're not careful, you can definitely end up losing your entire army. And last thing to point out is the fact that they do have some favorable matchups against many A and S tier civs. So I'm thinking, for example, Turks from S tier or Britons from A tier. Yeah, but overall, this civ just doesn't fit my style of play very much. I am more of a kind of player who likes to who focuses more on macro as well as reactive play, and the Mayans, I believe the way their style of playing and their tech tree just doesn't lend themselves well to that kind of style, and that's why ultimately I do not like the Civ at all for Arena. Number 3 on my D tier, we have the Goths. So the Goths, I mean, even on open maps, they're not considered very good, and in my book, even for on Arena, they're not particularly good. It's a pretty predictable one-trick pony civ that goes infantry 99.9% of the time, basically. That's what all their bonuses and their entire tech tree revolves around, essentially. They have no eco bonus at all whatsoever. The only thing that might resemble it is the fact that they kill their wild boars a little bit faster and their villagers can carry more meat, but yeah, it's for this kind of map, it's really just not much of an eco bonus at all whatsoever. So you're not going to be commanding a very strong eco civ when you random Goths. They also, like some other civs, like for example Huns from C tier, they have absolutely terrible defensive capabilities. And it's essentially a reverse Huns, if you think about it. So where the Huns don't have houses but do have access to stone walls, the Goths have access to houses but they don't get stone walls. So that means internal walling will be harder to accomplish, much less similar way with the Huns, but at least you're a lot more likely to internal wall with houses than you are with stone walls. So it's not like the Goths are incapable of doing that kind of thing. They also have no tower upgrades, so again, if they're pressured by heavy like a lot of siege or like a smush or something, they're going to have to default to other things like a defensive castle or cavalry or things like that. And yeah, it's just not going to be a very fun time for Goths. That being said, they are quite strong from the late Castle Age onward, so from late Castle Age to maybe mid-Imperial Age, before more population-efficient units start coming into play. They are actually pretty strong civ. So if you are able to hold on and just bide your time while you're playing defensively, like with say a defensive castle, while you're trying to boom behind it, if you're able to get towards the later parts of the game, you can actually end up having favorable matchups against a good variety of civilizations out there. Maybe every civ, because the Imperial Age Goth flood of any combination of champions, halberdiers, and huscarls created at light speed is just incredibly obnoxious to deal with. And but the thing is, getting there, I mean, it's a pretty big if. It's a pretty big if, because many other civs, like from the higher tier civs, are capable of very fast, aggressive strategies, and they also have very strong tech trees and options as well. So they themselves can definitely go toe-to-toe with Goths. If they can get through the early to mid Imperial stage of the game, I feel, once because infantry is not really the most population efficient unit out there. Things like heavy cavalry or heavy siege are a lot more pop efficient in that sense. So the Goths, they're strong at a very particular point in the game, and then they're weak pretty much everywhere else. And it's their lack of defensive potential and their unfortunate struggle to hold on against many civs. It's the fact that this is one civ I almost always gather stone and boom behind, building the defensive castle if I need it and if I'm facing a lot of pressure. And depending on your map layout, it can save you, but other times it might not. Like, let's say your base is really wide at the front. One castle is not going to be able to cut it for defense. So it's you may need to build at least one more in order to properly secure yourself. And depending on how aggressively it goes, you may have to end up buying that second castle and maybe set your eco behind. But with that being said, what I do at least enjoy somewhat about Goths is the fact that I think this civ is a great equalizer of sorts. So it can help if they're played right and you have the right map. Goths is the kind of civ that can help you beat better players because they're so strong at the late castle to like early to mid Imperial stage of the game. I mean, I can personally attest having played against slightly better players like mid 1800, like 1850 to maybe like 19XX. And I had a pretty favorable matchup like Goths versus Britons against this one guy I remember. And he tried to pressure me with longbows, so I built my defensive castle, was able to defend until Imperial Age, where I was able to completely overrun him. So yeah, that was that was a pretty fun game. But overall, it's safe. It's safe to say this is not really the best Civ for Arena. It has just way too many problems for it to be any higher than D tier, in my opinion. But yeah, but it does have high points like this, so I can at least save them from the absolute like dead last in this tier. My penultimate Civ in D tier is the Khmer. Some would rate Khmer higher, but much like with Mayans, with me, I just really hate this Civ for Arena personally. So one of the main problems is the fact that this Civ is pretty one-dimensional, although not quite as much as Goths and Mayans before them, in my opinion. They do actually have a somewhat reasonable tech tree, but the fact of the matter is, outside of their two main units, Elephants and Scorpions, their tech tree their other units really just don't have a whole lot going for them. Their archery range, even though it's a nice open tech tree, none of their units really shine as a result of them missing thumb ring. So their arbalests are subpar, their skirms are slightly worse. Their heavy cav archers, even though they get every other upgrade, the fact that they don't have thumb ring means they're just about useless in every situation. Because at that point you're going to struggle to hit even a stationary target, because cav archers only have 50% accuracy rating, and at least their hand cannons are fully upgraded. But overall, it's just not the greatest archery range as a result of missing that tech. They also have pretty bad infantry. This is probably one of the civs that can give Persians a run for their money with regards to their infantry quality. That is very, very poor. They get two-handed swordsmen, but they don't have squires, and they don't get plate mail armor at their blacksmith. So really, their halberdiers are the only things that is the only thing at the barracks you might find somewhat useful, and even then, they're pretty low tier halbs. So that's a bit unfortunate. And the rest of their stable outside of elephants is also pretty mediocre. Only generic fully upgraded light cav and cavalier. So yeah, it's really nothing to celebrate over. The plus side, though, is their siege workshop is at least pretty decent. They only miss siege onager, which can be a loss in some situations, but at least they get everything else. They get siege rem, they get some of the best heavy scorpions in the game, and fun fact is that Khmer heavy scorps are actually considered the best scorpions in deathmatch, and even in RM 1v1, they're pretty top-notch scorpions. Although I think in the 1v1, like RM 1v1 scenario, I think some others, like for example Celts, might have something to say about that. Chinese as well. Don't quote me on that though, because I haven't really looked too much into it. So, like with some other civs in my higher tiers, they are extremely gold dependent because again, their two main units being elephants and siege, both of which absolutely guzzle gold like there's no tomorrow. And it doesn't really help that their trash is pretty mediocre as well. I mean, it's not the worst trash in the world, but it's really nothing special either. The thing about Khmer is the fact that they can actually match up favorably against civs without good halbs and or camels, but that's only if they can get up to mass elephants, which is not easy to do because, again, it's just a very expensive unit line. The elite upgrade cost, especially after the cost was increased significantly since, I believe, 2 patches ago from 5.7. It went from like 800 food, 500 gold to 1200 food, 900 gold. So it's a very expensive technology, and you're not going to be always able to field elite battle elephants, depending on the sort of map layout, the pace of the game, and things like that. Their mid-game boom is also good, not having to build any age-up buildings, so they can save the wood from not needing to build the market or the blacksmith, or maybe a stable, or maybe the barracks before a stable if they want to try and take map control, or an archery range. But and the fact that they do get 2 extra villagers in the Dark Age as a result of them being able to advance to Feudal Age and then immediately advance to Castle Age after that, assuming you have the resources required. It can make for a pretty nice boom in the mid-game, but it's just not enough to make up for the civilization's downsides, in my opinion, which is why I put them in the D tier, as well as in the number 4 spot. In the 5th and final civ in my D tier, and the last civ to talk about in the game, we have a pretty worthy civilization for this spot, the Vietnamese. So it's really no surprise at this point that the Vietnamese is just not a very good civ on most map types and settings, and they're not very good on open maps like Arabia, and they're not really all too great on closed maps either, like this on Arena. So much like others like Goths or other civs, they don't really have much of an eco bonus or any eco bonus of any description. They really, all they get is just being able to see their opponent's town center at the start of the game, which can be somewhat useful on open maps, like maybe you can lure deer easier, but I mean, you're not going to be going super aggro most of the time, unless you want to trush every single game. So the fact that you can see your opponent's TC from the start and their position on the map usually isn't really an impactful bonus in the slightest. They're pretty one-dimensional, with only their archers receiving any kind of military bonus, so they get a 20% HP boost over regular archers. But I mean, that's not really enough to make up for the fact that their archers are still weak to all the normal things, so they'll still die en masse to skirmishers. They'll still get flattened by onagers and siege onagers all the same. The only time it really helps at all is when they're up against other archers in like a straight up pitched fight. So that's when it can be somewhat useful, but overall it's a bonus to the fact that their archers are a little bit tankier usually isn't the most impactful military bonus in most cases, in my opinion. The fact that their archers are a bit tankier, though, can be decent for taking map control, especially if your opponent's trying to contest map control as well. That means your crossbows are a little bit more durable, therefore you can survive longer. But as an archer bonus, I feel like it just pales in comparison to those of, say, Britons or Ethiopians who have superior archers for that kind of purpose for taking map control. Their battle elephants have, in my opinion, the least applications and are the weakest overall, missing husbandry, missing blast furnace. So, unlike the other battle elephant civs who can use their battle elephants in a much more of an offensive, like a powerful offensive role, the Vietnamese battle elephants are kind of relegated to more of a defensive role to support their archers and whatnot. And even though they're statistically better than, say, Malay battle elephants, Malay at least get access to things like heresy and faith, whereas the Vietnamese don't have heresy, and so they're still vulnerable to conversions, whereas Malay can deal with monks. They're theoretically favored against any archer-based civ, but the fact of the matter is most archer-based civs like Britons, Ethiopians, Mayans, the 3 main archer civilizations, all have eco bonuses associated with them, while the Vietnamese don't. So, and those other archer civs can potentially leverage those bonuses to their advantage to try and take out the Vietnamese. Their late game is good. I'd say, it's okay, it's pretty good all things considered, but again, with so many flaws regarding their military as well as their just parts of their military tech tree, as well as the fact they don't have any economy bonus, means they're very unlikely to ever reach that stage of the game, and so they're just not able to shine properly. But and even if they do get there to the late game, there are still stronger late game civs out there, in my opinion. And yeah, just the Vietnamese. I think the secret's out right about now, by this point, that they can definitely use some kind of buff. I hope that they'll receive something with the next balance patch, and hopefully that can start making this civilization more competitive. But in its current state, this civ is definitely not useful on Arena, and like I mentioned at the start, of the Vietnamese commentary, it's not really useful on a whole lot of map types. And so with that closes out my D tier and also closes out this series. So if you've been able to stick around until this point, I congratulate you. Just putting up with me rambling for half an hour periods or even 40-minute periods per video, just going into extreme in-depth with each civ. I'm just a very thorough guy. I really want to make sure I get as many details about these civs down as possible. And yeah, it just resulted in a very, very lengthy, very long videos. But I hope you at least found these informative and was able to really showcase the kinds of civs that I like versus the civs that I don't. There are probably some surprises for you, I would imagine, throughout this series. But yeah, it's just how I feel about these civs, and you're welcome to agree or disagree with it. I'll definitely explain my reasoning if I'm ever confronted by these sorts of questions. So if you have any, just leave them in the comments below if you feel so inclined. And I guess until next time, until the next video I make, I guess, see ya.